The greatest conquerors in history are remembered for their epic battles, yet their most enduring victories were not won on the battlefield. They were won in the quiet, dusty rooms where scribes tallied grain and officials drafted tax codes. This is an investigation into the invisible machinery of power. By the end, you will understand the precise set of administrative tools that turned fleeting conquests into lasting empires, revealing the hidden blueprint behind the ancient world's superpowers. How did a ruler in Persia command loyalty from Egypt, or an emperor in Rome collect taxes from Britain? The answer lies not in the charisma of a leader, but in the dull, systematic genius of governance. What does it truly take to hold a world together? The real enemy of every would-be emperor was not a rival army, but the simple, relentless passage of time. A ruler could issue a command from his capital, but by the time a messenger on horseback delivered it to a distant province, weeks or even months had gone by. In that span, local officials could ignore the order, a rebellion could spark and burn, or a harvest could fail without the central government ever knowing until it was far too late. This was the tyranny of distance, the first and most brutal constraint on ancient power. It created a fundamental paradox. How do you control what you cannot see and manage what you cannot immediately reach? The personal, face-to-face rule that worked for a city-state or a small kingdom shattered over vast territories. A king might know every noble in his home region, but he could not possibly know the customs, the leaders, or the grievances of people 1,000 miles away who spoke a different language and worshipped different gods. Furthermore, extracting the resources needed to sustain an empire, grain for soldiers, silver for salaries, timber for ships, became a logistical nightmare when those resources were scattered across continents. And perhaps the most delicate challenge was integration. Conquering a land was one thing. Convincing its people to see themselves as part of your empire, to obey your laws and pay your taxes, was an entirely different struggle. This was the core problem of scale, a breakdown in communication, control, and cohesion. The story of empire, then, is the story of inventing systems to solve these impossible problems, to build a framework of rules so sturdy it could withstand the weight of the world itself. The solution to this paradox began with a simple, revolutionary act, writing something down, but this was not the writing of epic poems or sacred hymns. This was a new, pragmatic kind of writing born from necessity. The first great administrative tool was the systematic, standardized record. In the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia, the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform pressed into clay tablets did not just tell stories of gods and kings. They recorded something far more powerful: numbers. A tablet might list the exact amount of barley owed by a farmer named Namu, the number of sheep in a temple's herd, or the workdays owed by a citizen for maintaining irrigation canals. These were the birth certificates of bureaucracy. In Egypt, alongside the majestic hieroglyphs on tomb walls, scribes used a faster, cursive script called hieratic to perform the empire's mundane accounting. They conducted censuses not just of people but of livestock and wells. They drafted inventories for royal warehouses, detailing every jar of honey, every bolt of linen. This created an institutional memory that outlasted any individual pharaoh. A new ruler could open the scrolls and know precisely what the kingdom produced, what it stored, and what it was owed. Even in ancient China, the earliest writings on oracle bones, used to divine the will of ancestors, gradually evolved. They began to note the outcomes of military campaigns, the receipt of tributes, and the appointments of officials. Writing had been captured and put to work. It was no longer just a voice for the divine or the glorious. It became the silent, relentless accountant of the state. This shift created something empires desperately needed: a permanent, verifiable reality. A local governor could no longer claim the harvest failed if the central archives showed the expected yield from his province. A tax collector could not easily skim silver if every payment was recorded on a tablet filed in the capital. Writing made promises and obligations concrete. It turned the fuzzy, unreliable world of verbal agreements and distant reports into a ledger of facts. It built a foundation of knowledge that allowed a central power to see, however dimly, into its farthest territories. The empire now had a memory, and with that memory came the first real semblance of control. But a ledger of facts alone was not enough to govern. A farmer in Babylon and a merchant in a distant province might both be recorded in the royal archives, but if they lived under completely different sets of rules, the empire remained a patchwork of local customs, not a unified state. The second critical tool solved this by moving from recording resources to regulating behavior, the written, codified law. This was far more than a list of crimes and punishments. It was a revolutionary administrative instrument. Before codification, law was often customary, passed down orally by elders or local chieftains. Its application could be unpredictable, varying from village to village, swayed by personal relationships or the mood of the day. For an empire trying to administer 1,000 different communities, this local arbitrariness was a poison to central control. A dispute over a loan or a property boundary might be settled one way in the north and another in the south, creating confusion, resentment, and a sense that the central authority was absent or irrelevant. The great innovation was to inscribe the law in stone, clay, or bronze, and to send copies of that text throughout the land. The most famous early example is the Code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylon. While we often focus on its famous principle of an eye for an eye, its true power for empire building was administrative. At the top of the stele, Hammurabi is depicted receiving the symbols of justice from the sun god Shamash. This was a powerful message. These laws came not from Hammurabi the man, but from divine authority, granting them a weight beyond challenge. But for the officials tasked with daily governance, the code functioned as a massive reference manual. It contained 282 specific rulings covering everything from commercial contracts and property, rights to family matters and professional liabilities. If a builder's poorly constructed house collapsed and killed the owner, the law stated the builder was to be put to death. If a man accused another of sorcery, they were to undergo a river ordeal. The one who sank was deemed guilty. These were not suggestions, they were standardized protocols. Imagine you are a provincial judge appointed by the king. A complex case about irrigation water rights or a disputed inheritance lands on your bench. Instead of relying on local tradition or your own personal sense of fairness, you could consult the same stone code that judges in every other city were consulting. You could find a precedent, apply the prescribed judgment, and in doing so, you were enforcing the king's law, not local custom. This created predictability, a cornerstone of stable rule. A merchant could travel from one end of the empire to the other with a clearer understanding of the rules governing his trade. A farmer knew the fixed interest rate on a grain loan. This predictability reduced conflicts and made the vast, diverse territory feel more like a single legal space. Crucially, it also reined in local officials. A corrupt or capricious governor could no longer invent laws on the spot. He was now accountable to a published standard that even his subjects could, in theory, point to. The code was a proclamation that royal authority reached into the daily lives of every subject, settling their disputes and defining their obligations. It turned the abstract idea of the king's justice into a tangible, consistent system. By replacing the whisper of local tradition with the clear, unchanging voice of written law, empires began to weave their scattered conquests into a coherent whole, governed not by the whims of men, but by the unyielding text of the state. Yet a list of laws, no matter how comprehensive, is powerless without the means to enforce it. The third tool provided that power by fueling the entire imperial machine: systematic taxation. This was the leap from demanding occasional tribute to building a predictable, renewable financial engine. In the early days of conquest, a victorious king might simply demand a one-time payment of gold, grain, or slaves from a defeated city. This was plunder, not policy. It was unpredictable, often sparked resentment, and did nothing to build lasting infrastructure. The administrative genius was to transform this sporadic taking into a regular, calculated giving. It turned subjects into sustainable resources. Different empires engineered their own versions of this financial pump. The Persian Empire, under rulers like Darius I, mastered the quota system. They divided their vast territory into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap. But the satrap's primary administrative duty was financial. He was responsible for delivering a fixed, annual sum of silver talent to the royal treasury. The amount was not arbitrary. It was calculated based on an assessment of the province's estimated wealth and productivity. A fertile river valley might owe 500 talents, while a mountainous region of herders might owe 100. This created a predictable budget for the central state. The Persian king could plan massive construction projects, maintain standing armies, and fund road networks because he knew, within reason, what revenue would arrive each year. It shifted the burden of collection and local assessment onto the satrap, who in turn had to develop his own minor bureaucracy to extract wealth from cities, temples, and landowners within his province. The Roman Republic, and later the Empire, refined this further with the tool of the census. Roman officials would travel to a province not just to count people, but to assess the value of everything they owned: land, buildings, slaves, livestock, even tools. This detailed inventory, recorded in ledgers, became the basis for a property tax. It was profoundly bureaucratic and impersonal. Your tax bill was not based on who you were or what your local chieftain said you owed. It was a percentage of your declared assets. This system demanded an immense administrative apparatus: census takers, assessors, registrars, and of course, collectors. It also created a permanent paper trail that made evasion difficult. In China, during the Qin and Han dynasties, the system was elegantly interlocked. A national census recorded every household and its members. This record was then used to calculate two primary obligations: a land tax based on the productivity of the fields a family farmed, and a poll tax, a per-person fee. The records were so vital that they were kept in duplicate, with one copy stored locally and another sent to the central archives. This allowed the state to track population movements, anticipate revenue, and allocate resources for projects like the Great Wall or the massive granary system that stabilized the food supply. The true sophistication of systematic taxation, however, lay not in the act of taking, but in the mechanisms it forced empires to invent. Assessment required surveyors who could measure land and scribes who could value property. Collection required a network of trustworthy, or at least accountable, officials who would bring the wealth to regional depots. And most importantly, audit required a separate layer of administration to check the books, to ensure the local governor was not pocketing half the silver for himself. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. Taxes paid for the soldiers who secured the borders, the judges who upheld the law, and the scribes who kept the records. Those records, in turn, made taxation more efficient, funding even more administration. It was the lifeblood of the state, circulating through the veins of roads and courier systems, nourishing the heart of the empire. Without this predictable flow of resources, the grandest legal code was just words on stone, and the most detailed census was merely a list of names. Taxation built the physical reality of imperial power, but a predictable flow of silver and grain created a new problem of its own. How could an empire ensure that a bushel of wheat measured in one province was the same as a bushel measured 1,000 miles away? How could a merchant from a coastal city trust the weight of silver promised to him in a mountain town? The fourth tool solved this by imposing a universal language of value and quantity, standardized weights, measures, and currency. This was the administrative act that turned a collection of local economies into a single, integrated imperial market. Before standardization, trade and taxation were mired in local peculiarities. A mina, a unit of weight, might be slightly heavier in a wealthy commercial city, giving its merchants an advantage. A cubit, a unit of length, could vary from one temple's construction project to another. This was more than an inconvenience, it was a barrier to control. A central treasury could not accurately assess the wealth of a province if every region used its own measuring cups and scales. Corruption was effortless. A tax collector could use an oversized vessel to demand more grain, or a merchant could use doctored weights to cheat both his customers and the king's tax assessors. The breakthrough was a physical one. In the kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Turkey, rulers in the 7th century before the Common Era did something astonishing. They took lumps of electrum, a natural mix of gold and silver, and stamped them with an official mark. This mark guaranteed both the weight and the purity of the metal. The coin was born. It was a portable, trustworthy piece of the state's promise. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great and his successors saw the immense administrative potential of this invention. They adopted coinage on a massive scale, minting the famous gold daric and silver shekel. These coins were not primarily for everyday market trade among common people. Their first and most crucial use was governmental, to pay the empire's vast network of soldiers and salaried officials. Imagine you are a Greek mercenary serving in the Persian army, far from home. Your pay is not a promise of local goods or an IOU from a general. It is a handful of silver coins, each bearing the image of the Persian king. That coin is accepted anywhere the king's authority reaches. You can buy food, supplies, or save it, knowing its value is guaranteed by the might of the entire empire. This system created a direct, tangible link between the central state and every individual in its employ. Loyalty could now be reliably purchased and sustained across continents. Meanwhile, in China, the first emperor Qin Shi Huang pursued standardization with even more sweeping ruthlessness after unifying the warring states. He decreed that the entire realm would use the same units of length, volume, and weight. Official bronze standards were cast and distributed to every county. The width of cart axles was even standardized so their wheels would fit in the same ruts on the empire's new roads. This was not about convenience for merchants, though it certainly helped trade. It was, first and foremost, an administrative masterstroke for taxation and control. When the imperial tax code demanded 1/10 of a farmer's harvest, that harvest was now measured with the same vessel in every village. The state's share was no longer a matter of local interpretation. The same principle applied to conscription. If the law required a cloth tax of 2 bolts per household, a bolt was now a fixed length everywhere. This eliminated a universe of fraudulent excuses and local bargaining. It made the empire's demands brutally transparent and uniformly enforceable. The power of this tool was profound. It reduced friction. A merchant could travel from the Persian capital to Egypt without needing to constantly haggle over exchange rates between different silver bars or weights. He could trade in coins. It enhanced transparency. Both the taxpayer and the tax collector now referenced the same unchanging standard, reducing petty corruption and building a fragile sense of fair dealing, or at least predictable dealing with the central state. Most importantly, it fostered integration. When people across a vast empire used the same coins to buy goods, the same scales to sell grain, and the same measuring rods to build homes, they were unconsciously participating in a shared economic system. They were being woven into a single fabric of daily life. The state's authority was no longer just a distant army or a posted law. It was in their pockets, in their market stalls, in the very tools they used every day. Standardization made the abstract idea of belonging to an empire something you could literally hold in your hand. Yet all these tools, the ledgers, the laws, the tax rolls, the coins, were inert without the human hands to wield them. The fifth and perhaps most transformative tool was not a physical object or a written code, but a social invention, the professional bureaucrat. This was the creation of a new class of literate, trained administrators whose primary loyalty was to the state system itself, not to a local tribe, a wealthy family, or even necessarily to the ruler personally. They were the living, breathing circuitry of the imperial machine. In Egypt, this ideal was embodied in the scribble class. From a young age, boys from certain families were trained in the demanding art of hieratic script and the complex mathematics of granary management. They memorized texts that praised their own profession with sayings like, "Be a scribe, your limbs will be sleek, your hands will grow soft." This was more than job training. It was indoctrination into a caste that saw itself as the essential pillar of Maat, the cosmic order. A scribe in Thebes and a scribe in Memphis, though separated by the length of the Nile, shared the same education, the same professional pride, and the same duty to the divine office of the pharaoh. Their loyalty was to the system that gave them status and purpose. China perfected this concept into one of history's most stable administrative engines, the scholar official, selected through the imperial examination system. The genius of this system was its theoretical meritocracy. While in practice it favored the wealthy who could afford years of study, the principle was revolutionary. To serve the emperor, you did not need to be born into a noble family or be a brilliant general. You needed to master the Confucian classics, to internalize a philosophy that emphasized hierarchy, loyalty, and benevolent administration. Passing the grueling, multi-day exam in a guarded examination cell did not just test your knowledge, it tested your assimilation into the state ideology. A scholar from the southern rice paddies and one from the northern plains, if they both passed, entered the same bureaucratic corps. They spoke the same administrative language, followed the same procedures, and were rotated through posts across the empire to prevent them from building local power bases. Their allegiance was to the idea of the celestial empire and the bureaucratic ladder they climbed within it. The Roman Empire developed its own version with the equites, or the equestrian order. Originally a cavalry class, under Augustus and his successors they were transformed into a professional managerial corps. While the old senatorial aristocracy held the highest prestige, the equestrians were the empire's hands-on executives. They served as provincial financial officers, prefects of the grain supply, and even commanders of the Praetorian Guard. Their advancement was tied directly to competent service to the emperor and the state. They were salaried professionals moving from post to post, their careers a testament to the system's need for reliable, skilled managers who could run the day-to-day machinery of government without the distractions of aristocratic politics. This human tool created something empires had never achieved before: institutional continuity and expertise independent of any single ruler's charisma or lifespan. A pharaoh could die, a dynasty could fall, even an emperor could be assassinated, but the scribes still showed up to audit the grain stores. The provincial governor appointed by the new ruler would arrive to find the same tax assessment ledgers, maintained by the same class of officials who had served his predecessor. The bureaucracy became the empire's long-term memory and its operational manual. It tempered the volatility of personal rule with the dull, predictable rhythm of procedure. This professional class also acted as a powerful unifying force. A Chinese magistrate sent to govern a frontier region brought with him not just the emperor's authority, but the entire cultural and administrative package of the central state, its written language, its legal interpretations, its standards. He was a walking outpost of the imperial system, slowly, through daily governance, acculturating the periphery to the norms of the center. The state was no longer just an abstract idea. It had a face, a voice, and a set of very specific forms to be filled out in triplicate. Even the most perfect bureaucracy, however, could only govern what it could reach. The sixth tool physically connected the empire's brain to its distant limbs, the state-built infrastructure of roads and canals. This was not merely about impressive engineering. It was the literal laying down of control, a physical network designed to accelerate command and extract resources with ruthless efficiency. The Persian Royal Road stands as a monumental example, stretching over 1,600 miles from the imperial capital of Susa to the Aegean coast. It was not a simple dirt track. It was a carefully maintained highway, wide enough for 2 chariots to pass, with paved sections and bridges across rivers. Its true administrative genius, however, lay in the relay stations placed every 14 to 20 miles along its length. At each station, fresh horses, fodder, and dedicated couriers waited at the ready. A royal messenger carrying sealed dispatches could ride at a gallop to the next station, swap his exhausted mount for a fresh one in minutes, and continue without pause. This system, called the Angarian, allowed a message to travel the entire length of the road in just 7 days, a journey that would take a normal caravan 3 months. Information, the lifeblood of empire, now flowed at the speed of a horse. A rebellion in a distant province could be reported to the king almost as it began, and his orders for troop movements could race back with similar speed. The road was a physical leash, dramatically shortening the distance between command and consequence. The Romans took this concept and systematized it into the backbone of their world. Their famous roads, built with layers of gravel, sand, and fitted stone, were marvels of durability, but their purpose was unequivocally military and administrative first. They radiated from the golden milestone in the Roman Forum, proclaiming that all paths led to the heart of the state. Upon this network, Emperor Augustus established the cursus publicus, the imperial courier and transportation service. It was a logistical monopoly. Official way stations provided not just horses but wagons, lodging, and supplies for any traveler on state business, tax collectors, census officials, judges on circuit, and of course the military. A governor in Britain could send a report to Rome knowing it would travel on a scheduled, protected system. This created a predictable rhythm to imperial governance. The state's agents were always in motion, and their ability to move reliably meant the emperor's will could be felt consistently in every corner of the realm. The roads also served as potent symbols of Roman power, a constant visual reminder that legions could march down that straight, unyielding path to any town that contemplated defiance. In China, the administrative challenge was shaped by geography and a primary resource, grain. The fertile rice-producing regions of the south had to feed the political and military centers of the north, and the Grand Canal was the monumental solution. Beginning as early as the 5th century before the Common Era and expanded over centuries, this artificial river system linked the Yellow River and the Yangtze. It was the empire's economic aorta. Government grain barges, part of a massive tribute transport system, moved millions of tons of rice northward to supply the capital's population and the frontier armies. This was not left to private merchants. It was a state-run logistical operation with officials managing locks, monitoring water levels, and combating siltation. The canal ensured that the central government literally held the food supply of its most critical regions in its own hands. A local governor could not hoard grain or use hunger as a political weapon when the central state could float sustenance past his very gates. This infrastructure of control served a dual purpose. It accelerated the state's actions and simultaneously slowed down potential threats. A rebel army moved at the speed of marching men and their supply carts, bogged down by terrain. The Imperial Courier on the Royal Road moved at a sustained gallop. The legion on the Roman highway moved in disciplined columns over a firm surface. The grain barge on the Grand Canal moved with the relentless current of state planning. These networks turned the vast, unwieldy geography of empire into a mapped, measured, and manageable space. They were the steel threads in the imperial loom, upon which the fabric of law, taxation, and communication could be woven into a single, durable tapestry of power. But a network of roads and canals was just a passive skeleton. To truly animate an empire, to make it think and react, required a seventh tool that turned those stone paths into living nerves, the state-controlled postal and courier system. This was more than just a faster way to send mail. It was the empire's central nervous system, a dedicated channel for the raw data of command and control. Without it, the grandest infrastructure was just a monument, and the wisest edicts from the capital were just words trapped in a palace. The Persian Angarian we mentioned earlier was a prime example of this system weaponized. Its couriers were not casual travelers, they were elite agents of the state, sworn to deliver their dispatches through any weather or danger. The Greek historian Herodotus, in awe of their efficiency, left us the famous phrase inscribed on their relay stations: "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." This was not poetic license, but a statement of administrative doctrine. The system's reliability meant that a satrap in Egypt knew his annual tax report would reach the King of Kings on schedule, and that any deviation from his orders would be reported just as swiftly. It created a powerful psychological effect. The center felt perpetually present, its gaze implied by the constant traffic of official messengers. Half a world away, the Inca Empire solved the same problem of mountainous terrain with breathtaking human endurance. Their system relied on the chasquis, a corps of highly trained relay runners. Along the Incas' vast network of stone-paved roads and rope bridges, small huts were positioned every few miles, often within sight of each other. A chasqui runner would sprint at full speed to the next hut, shout his memorized message or hand over a knotted quipu cord record to the waiting runner, who would then burst into his own sprint. Through this continuous high-speed relay, a message could travel over 150 miles in a single day. Fresh fish from the coast could be delivered to the Inca ruler in the highland capital of Cusco before it spoiled. More critically, news of a rebellion or a crop failure in a distant valley could reach the central authority with stunning speed, allowing for a rapid, calibrated response. The empire's intelligence moved at the pace of a human heart pushed to its limit. The Romans formalized this into the cursus publicus, perhaps the most comprehensive state communication service before the telegraph. Established by Emperor Augustus, it was a logistical monopoly. Official travelers bearing the imperial diploma, a certificate of authority, had the right to use the system's horses, wagons, way stations, and supplies. This was not a public postal service, it was a closed circuit for government business. A provincial governor's tax revenues, a general's request for reinforcements, a census official's population rolls, all traveled on this protected, prioritized network. The system even had different classes of service: the fast cursus velox for urgent messages and light cargo, and the slower cursus clabularis for heavy shipments like bulk grain or construction materials for the legions. The true power of these systems lay in what they enabled: real-time governance of an ancient world. They allowed for a continuous feedback loop. A local official's report on a border incursion would flow to the capital. The emperor and his advisors would debate and issue orders. Those orders would race back along the same channels to mobilize legions or dispatch an envoy. This cycle of report, decision, and command, compressed from months into weeks or days, fundamentally shrank the psychological and practical size of the empire. A province no longer felt like a distant, forgotten land. It was a spoke in a wheel that was constantly turning, connected to the hub by the rhythmic pounding of runners' feet, the steady trot of couriers' horses, and the rumble of official carts. The courier system transformed the emperor from a remote, mythical figure into an active, responsive manager whose will could be felt almost as soon as it was formed. It was the ultimate tool for imposing a single rhythm, the rhythm of the state, upon the disparate tempos of 1,000 different communities. But to manage a population, you first had to know it existed. This leads us to the 8th foundational tool, the Census and Population Register. This was the ultimate act of administrative inventory, a systematic effort to count not just people, but the entire human and material wealth of the realm. It transformed subjects from a faceless mass into a quantified, categorized resource, and in doing so, made them governable on an unprecedented scale. For the Roman Republic and later the Empire, the census was the very bedrock of citizenship and obligation. Every 5 years, Roman citizens were required to present themselves before a censor, a high-ranking official. This was not a simple head count. Each head of a household had to declare under oath a detailed list of his property, the value of his land, the number of his slaves, his livestock, even his household goods. This declaration determined his place in the complex social and political hierarchy, from the senatorial class down to the common citizen. More crucially for the state, it determined his tax liability and his military duty. A man's wealth class dictated whether he could serve as an officer, a cavalryman, or a foot soldier, and what kind of armor he was expected to provide. The Roman census was therefore a dual-purpose instrument. It was a financial ledger and a military draft board rolled into one. It created a constantly updated database of manpower and capital, allowing the state to plan campaigns and fund them with precision. In Han Dynasty China, the census reached a remarkable level of sophistication and centralization. The state's need to mobilize labor for colossal projects, the Great Wall, irrigation canals, imperial tombs, and to collect the land and poll taxes demanded perfect knowledge. The Han bureaucracy conducted nationwide censuses with detailed registers compiled at the county level and then sent in duplicate to the central archives. These registers didn't just list names, they recorded the age, gender, and sometimes even the physical condition of every member of a household. They noted the amount and quality of land the family farmed. This data allowed officials to calculate exact tax quotas and to summon specific individuals for the corvée labor system, which required each adult to contribute a set number of days per year to state projects. The efficiency was chilling. If a new section of wall needed building, the central ministry could consult its registers, determine which counties had a surplus of able-bodied men, and issue orders to draft them. The individual became a data point in a vast imperial spreadsheet, his life and labor allocated by a distant administrator with a brush and a scroll. Perhaps the most ingenious system of demographic accounting, however, belonged to the Inca, who managed it without a written script. Their tool was the quipu, a complex array of knotted cords made from cotton or llama wool. A quipu was not merely a counting device, it was a sophisticated record-keeping system. Trained specialists called quipukamayaks could encode vast amounts of information into these knots. The position of a knot on a cord, the type of knot, the color of the cord, and the way cords were connected all held specific meaning. Through this tactile language, the Inca conducted meticulous censuses of their entire empire. A quipu could record the population of a village, broken down by age and gender for tax and labor purposes. It could inventory storehouses, listing quantities of maize, potatoes, cloth, and weapons. When the Spanish arrived, they were astonished to find that Inca officials, using these knotted cords, could provide more accurate and detailed accounts of provincial resources than their own scribes with pen and paper. The Quipu census allowed the Inca state to practice a form of redistributive economics, moving supplies from regions of plenty to those in need, and to marshal the massive labor force that built their legendary road network and terraced mountainsides. In each case, the purpose was the same: to illuminate the dark. Before the census, a population was a mystery. A ruler might know his immediate court and army, but the millions in the countryside were an unknown quantity. The census brought them into the light of the state. It answered the fundamental administrative questions: who are they, where are they, what do they have? And most importantly, what can they provide? This knowledge was the prerequisite for everything else. You could not levy a fair tax if you did not know how many taxpayers existed. You could not raise a legion if you did not know where the men of fighting age lived. You could not plan a granary system if you did not know how many mouths needed to be fed. The census turned the abstract concept of the people into a classified, actionable asset. It was the final, crucial step in completing the imperial circuit. The moment the state's gaze, having built the roads and trained the bureaucrats, finally settled with calculating precision upon every single individual within its domain. A census reveals the empire's resources, but it cannot manage them from a single throne room. This creates the ninth and perhaps most perilous tool in the imperial arsenal, the model of provincial governance. Every empire faced the same dilemma. To govern effectively, you must delegate power to local administrators, but in doing so, you risk creating rival power centers that could tear the realm apart. The solution was not to avoid delegation, but to structure it with brilliant, often ruthless, checks and balances. The Persian Empire pioneered a model of distributed control with the satrapy system. After conquering a region, they would install a satrap, a governor who was often a relative or trusted noble. The satrap's duty was clear: maintain order, collect the annual silver tax quota, and forward it to the royal treasury. But the Persians understood the danger of concentrating too much power in one man's hands. Therefore, they separated the civilian and military chains of command. While the satrap governed, a separate general, reporting directly to the King of Kings, commanded the local garrison. Furthermore, royal inspectors known as the king's eyes and ears traveled the empire unannounced, auditing the satrap's administration and listening for whispers of disloyalty. This system was designed to foster mutual suspicion in service of the crown. The satrap and the general would watch each other, each knowing the other could report him for treason, while both feared the unseen inspector. It was a masterclass in dividing power to preserve the center's ultimate authority. The Roman Republic took a different, yet equally calculated, approach with its provinces. A conquered territory was assigned to a proconsul or propraetor, a senior senator who had just finished his term in high office in Rome. This was a one-year appointment, later sometimes extended. The genius of this model was its temporary nature and its integration with Rome's own political career ladder. A proconsul went to a province not to build a personal dynasty, but to gain wealth and prestige before returning to the political fray in Rome. His time was short, limiting his ability to forge deep, seditious bonds with the local population. Furthermore, he was acutely aware that upon his return, he could be prosecuted for corruption or abuse of power by his political rivals. This constant accountability, both the clock and the threat of future prosecution, acted as a powerful restraint. The province was not a personal fiefdom. It was a temporary assignment, a single rung on the Roman cursus honorum, the sequence of public offices. In China, the Qin and Han dynasties constructed perhaps the most elaborate and centralized system of all, the commandery and county structure. The empire was divided into commanderies, each overseen by a centrally appointed governor. Each commandery was further subdivided into counties, run by magistrates. The critical innovation was that these officials were not native to the regions they governed. A magistrate from the north could be assigned to a county in the humid south. He served a fixed term, after which he was rotated to another post, often in a different part of the empire. This rotation system served two devastatingly effective purposes. First, it prevented officials from putting down local roots and building independent power bases. A magistrate had no long-standing alliances with local gentry to exploit. Second, it ensured that the official's primary loyalty and identity remained tied to the central bureaucratic system that assigned his posts and determined his promotions. He was a creature of the imperial center, temporarily residing in the periphery. His success was measured by how efficiently he implemented central policies, collected taxes, and maintained order, not by how well he integrated into local society. All three models grappled with the same unsolvable tension: the need for local flexibility versus the demand for central uniformity. A satrap in Egypt needed to understand Nile flood patterns. A proconsul in Britain needed to navigate tribal alliances. A Chinese magistrate in the frontier needed to manage relations with nomadic herdsmen. Granting them some autonomy was practical. Yet too much autonomy invited secession. The history of empires is littered with powerful governors who decided the throne looked better from their own provincial capital. Therefore, each system embedded a paradox. It gave a man enough power to do his job effectively, while constructing an invisible cage of checks, reports, rival authorities, and limited tenure to ensure he could never turn that power fully against the throne. The provincial model was the empire's gamble, placing vast authority in the hands of a few, while betting that the system of constraints around them would hold. It was administrative judo, using the very weight of delegated power to keep the center balanced, stable, and ultimately in control. Yet power enforced solely through ledgers and legions is a fragile thing. It demands constant effort and breeds silent resentment. The 10th and most subtle tool addressed this by targeting not the body or the purse, but the mind itself, state-sponsored religion and ideology. This was the art of transforming raw power into legitimate authority, of making obedience feel not like submission, but like participation in a sacred or natural order. A shared belief system could accomplish what 10,000 soldiers could not. It could convince a conquered people that their new rulers were not oppressors, but rightful guardians of cosmic truth. The Persian Empire, under its Achaemenid dynasty, understood this perfectly. While famously tolerant of local customs and gods, the Persian kings actively promoted Zoroastrianism as a court religion and an ideological backbone for their rule. This faith, centered on a cosmic struggle between the force of truth and order and the force of the lie and chaos, provided a perfect metaphor for imperial administration. The Persian king was not just a political leader, he was the agent of Ahura Mazda, the god of light and wisdom, tasked with spreading truth and order across the earth. Inscriptions on royal monuments show the kings declaring that Ahura Mazda granted them the empire and that by the god's favor, they held the lands and made the peoples prosperous. This framed Persian conquest and rule not as mere aggression, but as a divine mission to bring civilization and stability to a chaotic world. A subject in Babylon or Egypt might keep their local gods, but they could understand the logic of a supreme deity endorsing a powerful, just king. It gave the empire a moral and spiritual purpose that transcended ethnicity and local loyalty. The Romans engineered a different but equally potent ideological machine. Early on, they developed the imperial cult, the veneration of the emperor and his family as divine or semi-divine beings. This was not necessarily about demanding that every subject believe the emperor was a literal god in the way Jupiter was. Instead, it was a brilliant political ritual, a public performance of loyalty. In every city and province, temples were built to the divine Augustus or the deified Claudius. Local elites competed for the honor of serving as priests in these cults, binding their own social status to the celebration of Roman power. To offer a sacrifice for the emperor's well-being was to visibly declare your allegiance to the Roman order. It created a universal language of loyalty that every community, regardless of its native tongue or traditional gods, could speak. Later, when Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity, he harnessed an even more powerful unifying force. By making Christianity the state religion, he co-opted a pre-existing, highly organized, and morally rigorous network that spanned the entire empire. The Church's hierarchy of bishops, with its seat now in Constantinople, could be aligned with the state's administrative structure. Christian doctrine, which preached obedience to earthly authorities as ordained by God, provided a powerful theological sanction for imperial rule. A shared faith in one God and one church helped glue together the empire's fracturing Latin West and Greek East, offering a common identity that could, for a time, outweigh regional differences. In China, the ideological tool was refined into a philosophy of power so elegant it sustained dynasties for millennia, the mandate of heaven. This concept held that the right to rule was granted by heaven itself, but only to a just and virtuous ruler. As long as the emperor governed with benevolence, maintained order, and ensured the people's welfare, he retained the mandate. However, if he became corrupt, incompetent, or tyrannical, heaven would withdraw its favor. Signs of this withdrawal were natural disasters like floods, famines, or earthquakes. These were interpreted not as random tragedies, but as cosmic report cards on the emperor's performance. This created a self-correcting narrative for political change. A successful rebellion that overthrew a dynasty was not mere treason. It was proof that heaven had transferred its mandate to a new, more worthy ruler. This ideology served two crucial administrative functions. First, it gave the current emperor a celestial justification for his power, elevating him to the Son of Heaven. Second, and more ingeniously, it provided a peaceful mechanism for political transition in theory, channeling discontent into a framework that emphasized stability and continuity of the system itself, rather than the individual dynasty. The power of these ideological tools was their ability to reduce the cost of control. A soldier stationed on a frontier is expensive. A tax collector invites resistance. But a priest in a temple, a bishop in a cathedral, or a scholar teaching the mandate of heaven could encourage voluntary compliance. They could turn the state's demands for taxes, labor, and obedience into spiritual duties or natural obligations. When people believe their ruler acts with divine sanction or cosmic purpose, they are far less likely to question his edicts. A shared ideology also created common ground among the empire's diverse peoples. A Greek merchant and an Egyptian farmer might have little in common, but if both participated in the rites of the imperial cult, they shared a ritual connection to Rome. A peasant in northern China and a scholar in the south might live vastly different lives, but both understood the world through the lens of the mandate of heaven. This shared framework built a collective identity that could, over generations, soften the hard edges of conquest. The empire became not just a political unit, but a civilization, a story that people told themselves about who they were and where they belonged in the order of things. It was the final, masterful layer of administration governing not just the land and its resources, but the very imagination of its inhabitants. But a shared ideology still needed a common tongue to articulate its commands. The 11th tool was the imposition of an official administrative language, a deliberate act that created a unified channel for power to flow from the center to every province. This was not about replacing the languages people spoke in their homes or markets. It was about constructing a single, official voice for the state itself, a linguistic bridge that allowed the empire to think and act as one entity. When Alexander the Great's generals carved his conquests into rival Hellenistic kingdoms, they faced a dizzying array of local dialects from Egypt to India. Their solution was to promote Koine Greek, a common, simplified form of the language, as the lingua franca of government, commerce, and high culture. A tax decree issued in Greek could be understood by officials in Alexandria, Antioch, and Babylon. This created a translocal elite, a class of administrators, merchants, and scholars who might be Egyptian, Syrian, or Persian by birth, but who were all educated in Greek thought and expression. They could serve in any court from the Mediterranean to the borders of India, their loyalty to the Hellenistic system reinforced by their shared intellectual language. The Roman Empire executed a similar, though more forceful, linguistic policy, especially in its western provinces. Latin was the language of law, the military, and high administration. To hold any position of real authority, to argue a case in a provincial court, or to command an auxiliary troop, one needed to speak and write Latin. This had a powerful homogenizing effect over centuries. Local Celtic or Iberian languages did not disappear from daily life, but they were pushed to the margins of official power. A tribal leader who wanted his sons to advance in the Roman world sent them to be educated in Latin rhetoric and law. Over generations, this created a provincial ruling class that was culturally Roman, thinking and governing in the language of the Caesars. It made the vast territory west of Italy feel administratively cohesive because every edict, every legal scroll, and every legionary's orders were written in the same precise tongue. Perhaps the most successful administrative language in history, however, was not spoken by its rulers as a native tongue. The Persian Empire, spanning from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, adopted Aramaic as its official bureaucratic language. The Persians themselves spoke Persian, but they recognized the practical genius of using a language that was already widely understood by merchants and scribes across the Near East. Aramaic, written in a simple alphabetic script on parchment or papyrus, was far easier to learn and use for record-keeping than the complex cuneiform of Mesopotamia or the hieroglyphs of Egypt. Imperial scribes were trained in this common script, and it became the medium for everything from royal proclamations to provincial tax records. This meant a caravan official in Sardis could file a report that a clerk in Persepolis could read instantly without the need for a translator. It created a seamless paper trail across cultures, making the empire's bureaucracy agile and remarkably efficient. In East Asia, classical Chinese performed a similar unifying role for over 2 millennia, far outlasting any single dynasty. This written language, with its complex characters, was divorced from the spoken dialects of the regions. A scholar in Korea, Japan, or Vietnam might pronounce the characters completely differently from a scholar in Beijing, but they could all read the same Confucian classic or imperial edict and derive the same meaning. This made classical Chinese the ultimate tool of elite integration across the Sinosphere. A Vietnamese Mandarin and a Chinese official could communicate through brush and ink, sharing a common administrative and philosophical vocabulary, even if they could not understand each other's speech. The effect of this linguistic standardization was profound. It built walls as much as it built bridges. It facilitated clear, unambiguous communication across vast distances, reducing errors and delays in governance. It created a powerful, exclusive class of literate administrators who owed their status to their mastery of the imperial language, binding their fortunes to the state that taught it to them. But it also systematically marginalized local languages and the cultures they carried, confining them to the realm of the personal, the folkloric, and the unofficial. Power spoke in one voice, and to be heard by power, you had to learn to speak its language. This linguistic layer was the final polish on the imperial machine, ensuring that when the center issued a command, it resonated with the same precise meaning from one edge of the world to the other. A language can unify command, but its words must be stored somewhere permanent. The 12th tool was the empire's physical brain, the state archive. This was more than a library or a dusty storeroom. It was a fortress of information, a deliberately constructed institutional memory designed to outlive any single ruler or dynasty. Within its walls, the empire's identity was not written in stone for public display, but meticulously recorded on clay, papyrus, and bamboo for administrative use. In ancient Mesopotamia, these were the tablet houses where countless cuneiform records were filed. A single such archive, like that of the city of Mari, contained tens of thousands of tablets. They held everything from diplomatic correspondence with neighboring kingdoms to mundane receipts for deliveries of wool and grain. This allowed a new governor arriving in a city to review a century of treaties, land grants, and legal precedents. He did not rule based on rumor or oral history. He governed by consulting the permanent, verifiable records of his predecessors. The empire's continuity was baked into the very clay of its files. The Persian kings built their own monumental archive at Persepolis. Here, in the heart of the ceremonial capital, they stored the administrative records of their vast realm on clay tablets and parchment scrolls. These were not just financial ledgers. They contained the official copies of royal decrees, the terms of vassal treaties, and the service records of officials and artisans from across the empire. When the Persian king needed to appoint a new satrap or assess the loyalty of a distant tribe, his advisors could pull the relevant dossier. The archive transformed governance from reactive guesswork into informed strategy, grounded in decades of accumulated data. In Rome, this function was housed in the tabularium, the record office built into the Capitoline Hill. Its very location, overlooking the Roman Forum, symbolized the foundational role of documentation in Roman power. Here, the state deposited copies of laws passed by the Senate, financial accounts of the provinces, and the census rolls that determined citizenship and taxation. The tabularium was the ultimate reference library for the Roman bureaucracy, a quaestor managing the treasury, a judge settling a boundary dispute between provinces, or a censor planning a new aqueduct all relied on the authoritative documents stored within its vaults. It ensured that the state operated on a single, consistent set of facts, preventing the chaos of conflicting claims and lost precedents. In China, the imperial archives were a cornerstone of dynastic legitimacy and administrative precision. From the Han Dynasty onward, a vast bureaucratic apparatus was dedicated to recording, copying, and preserving every significant state document. Histories of previous reigns, geographical surveys, population registers, and legal codes were compiled and stored in multiple copies to safeguard against loss. The grand historian Sima Qian, for instance, drew upon these very archives to compose his monumental records of the grand historian. This was not merely about preserving the past for scholars. It was a practical tool of statecraft. When a new emperor ascended the throne, he and his ministers studied the archived reports of past natural challenges, military campaigns, and tax reforms. They learned from the documented successes and failures of those who came before. The archive served as a training manual for empire, allowing each generation to build upon the institutional knowledge of the last. The power of the central repository was its ability to create a permanent, accessible truth. It ended arguments before they could start. A provincial governor claiming a special tax exemption could be silenced by producing the original charter for his region, stored in the capital. A foreign ambassador disputing the terms of a treaty could be shown the signed and witnessed copy. This centralized memory also protected the state from the frailties of human recollection. Officials died, local traditions shifted, but the archive's records remained unchanged. It was the ultimate check on corruption, forgetfulness, and rebellion. By amassing the empire's knowledge in one secure location, the state declared that its authority was rooted not in transient force, but in the enduring, meticulous record of its own actions. The archive was the empire consulting its own conscience, ensuring that every new decision was made in the cold, clear light of everything it had ever done before. But an archive can only record what has already been reported. To govern proactively, an empire needed eyes that could see what people tried to hide. This introduces a 13th shadowy tool, the internal spy network. While the courier system carried official messages, these covert agents carried whispered rumors and secret warnings, creating a parallel nervous system dedicated to fear and loyalty. They were the ultimate check on the other administrative tools, ensuring that no provincial governor, no matter how powerful, ever felt truly alone. The Persian system was famously known as the eyes and ears of the king. These were not a single, formal police force, but a network of trusted inspectors and informants who traveled the empire without announcement. Their mandate was direct: to watch the watchers. A satrap governing a wealthy province might believe himself secure in his distant palace, but he could never be certain if the merchant newly arrived in his court, or the minor official auditing his tax records, was in fact a royal agent. The psychological effect was profound. It institutionalized suspicion in service of the crown, ensuring that the empire's vast delegated power was never taken for granted. The Roman Empire developed a more structured and eventually notorious internal security apparatus. Initially, the task fell to the frumentarii, soldiers originally tasked with securing grain supplies for the legions. Their duties required them to travel extensively across the provinces, which made them perfect candidates for carrying secret dispatches and, in time, for gathering intelligence. By the 2nd century, they had evolved into the emperor's secret police, feared for their ability to detain citizens without public trial. Later, Emperor Diocletian reformed this system into the agents in rebus, the agents in affairs. These courier agents were embedded within the imperial bureaucracy itself, monitoring the efficiency and, more importantly, the loyalty of provincial governors and officials. Their presence meant that the smooth machinery of Roman administration was never free from an unseen audit, one concerned not with numbers but with allegiance. In China, during certain dynastic periods like the Ming, this concept reached a chilling level of organization with the establishment of formal secret police agencies like the Eastern Depot. Staffed by palace eunuchs directly answerable to the emperor, these bodies operated outside the normal judicial system. They had the authority to investigate, arrest, and interrogate anyone, including the highest scholar officials in the imperial bureaucracy. The purpose was explicitly to root out corruption and disloyalty, but their power often bred widespread fear. An official writing a critical report or a scholar composing a subtle poem of protest could never be sure if an agent was watching, reading, and interpreting his words as a threat to the throne. The function of these networks was not primarily to terrorize the common population, though that could be a side effect. Their main target was the empire's own administrative class. They solved the central paradox of delegation. How do you give a man enough power to govern effectively without him using that power to break away? The spy network was the answer. It meant that the governor who commanded the local garrison, the magistrate who collected the taxes, and the scribe who kept the census records all understood that their actions were being observed by a separate, invisible channel reporting directly to the center. This created a powerful deterrent against rebellion and large-scale corruption. It also served as an early warning system. Unrest could be snuffed out before it spread, and a disgruntled official could be recalled or neutralized before he could rally support. In this way, the spy network was the dark glue holding the imperial system together. It compensated for the inherent fragility of trust across vast distances. While roads carried the emperor's commands and laws defined his justice, the silent agents ensured that those commands were obeyed and that justice was not perverted for private gain. They represented the empire's understanding that perfect administrative systems, built on ledgers and laws, were ultimately run by fallible people, and to manage those people, sometimes the most powerful tool was not a written decree, but the quiet, unsettling certainty that someone was always listening. A permanent army stationed on a distant frontier represents the ultimate administrative paradox. It is the empire's clenched fist, but that fist must be fed, clothed, and armed every single day, year after year, often thousands of miles from the fertile fields and bustling workshops of the imperial heartland. This reality gave rise to a 14th tool, one that turned military defense into a relentless peacetime industry: the system of military logistics. This was not merely about supplying a campaign. It was the art of building a permanent pipeline to the empire's outermost edges, making the presence of power not a temporary visitation, but an enduring, well-provisioned fact. The Roman Empire's solution was the annona militaris, the military grain supply. This was a vast, state-managed system separate from the grain dole for the urban poor in Rome. Its sole purpose was to channel millions of tons of wheat, barley, and other staples to the legions guarding the Rhine, the Danube, and the deserts of the east. This was not left to chance or local markets. Provinces like Egypt and North Africa were designated as breadbaskets for the army. Their tax quotas were often paid directly in grain, which was then loaded onto massive cargo ships and sailed across the Mediterranean to central distribution ports. From there, a second logistical chain took over, using the famed Roman roads and river networks to move the supplies forward to frontier forts. Granaries at these forts, built with raised floors for ventilation, could hold a year's worth of food, insulating the garrison from failed local harvests or interrupted supply lines. The annona transformed the legionary from a conquering warrior into a permanent employee of the state, whose regular pay included a measured grain ration that arrived with bureaucratic predictability. His loyalty was secured not by plunder, but by a reliable paycheck in his stomach. The Persian Empire approached the same challenge with its characteristic blend of foresight and infrastructure. Along the length of the Royal Road and other strategic highways, they constructed a network of fortified storehouses. These were not simple shelters, but strategically stocked warehouses filled with grain, weapons, and fodder for horses. Their placement was calculated. A royal courier or a military column on the move could travel light, knowing that a fully provisioned station lay a day's journey ahead. More importantly, these depots allowed for the rapid concentration of force. If a rebellion erupted in a distant satrapy, the king could order troops from several regions to converge on the trouble spot. Each contingent could draw supplies from the same chain of storehouses, ensuring they arrived for battle fully equipped, not exhausted from hauling their own provisions across continents. This system turned the Persian road network into a living circulatory system, with these storehouses acting as beating hearts that pumped sustenance to the limbs of imperial power. In China, particularly during the Han Dynasty, the logistical innovation took a uniquely self-sufficient form: the military agricultural colony, or Tanshan. Facing the immense cost and difficulty of supplying vast armies along the arid northern frontier against nomadic confederations, Chinese strategists devised a brilliant plan. They would make the army feed itself. Soldier farmers, often veterans or settlers recruited from crowded central provinces, were stationed in these frontier zones with a dual mandate. They were to stand guard, but they were also issued tools and seeds and ordered to reclaim and cultivate the land. These garrison farms created permanent, fortified agricultural communities. The grain they produced went directly into the local garrison's granaries, drastically reducing the need for long, vulnerable supply trains from the interior. Over time, these colonies became more than just supply bases. They were engines of colonization and Sinicization, planting the seeds of Chinese agricultural society and administrative control in previously nomadic territories. The wall was not just a stone barrier, it was backed by a green belt of military farms, making the frontier not just defensible but sustainable. The true administrative genius of these systems lay in their permanence. They acknowledged that an empire's greatest expense and its greatest necessity was not the occasional war, but the constant, quiet cost of deterrence. Planning for a campaign is one thing. Planning for a century of watchful peace is an entirely different order of problem. It required a standing bureaucracy dedicated solely to procurement, storage, and distribution on a continental scale. It demanded surveyors to plan depot locations, quartermasters to manage inventories, and accountants to track every sack of grain from a provincial threshing floor to a soldier's mess kit on a windswept wall. This logistical machinery turned the abstract concept of a border into a tangible, well-fed reality. It meant that the empire's reach was not defined by where its soldiers could march, but by where its supply lines could reliably deliver their daily bread. The frontier army became the ultimate administrative project, a living testament to the fact that the deepest form of control is not the spectacular siege, but the mundane, uninterrupted meal delivered on time, year after year, to the farthest outpost in the world. Even the most efficient supply chain, however, operates in a silent world without a shared sense of time. For an empire to function as a single entity, it needed its distant provinces to march to the same temporal drumbeat. The 15th tool achieved this by imposing a universal rhythm on the realm, the state-mandated calendar. This was far more than a way to track seasons for farmers. It was a masterstroke of administrative synchronization, forcing the entire empire to live, work, and pay on the same schedule, creating a shared temporal framework that bound everyone to the central authority's clock. Before a unified calendar, time was a local affair. A village in Gaul might mark the new year by the first snowfall, while a town in Egypt calculated its months by the rise of the star Sirius and the flooding of the Nile. Religious festivals, tax due dates, and market days all followed these disparate celestial or agricultural cues. For a central government, this was administrative chaos. How could you demand taxes from every province on the same day if no two regions agreed on when that day actually was? How could you summon officials to the capital for an annual meeting if their journey was timed by different lunar cycles? The solution was to declare that time itself would now be dictated by the state. The Roman Republic's calendar, based on lunar cycles, had fallen into such disarray that the civic year was drifting wildly out of sync with the solar seasons. By the time of Julius Caesar, the month meant for autumn festivals was actually occurring in high summer. This was more than an embarrassment. It disrupted the entire schedule of state, the terms of elected officials, the dates for court sessions, and the collection of revenues were all tied to a broken clock. Caesar's reform, advised by the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, was a profound act of administrative engineering. The Julian calendar discarded the unreliable moon and locked the year firmly to the sun, creating a 12-month, 365-day year with a leap day added every 4 years. This new calendar was promulgated by imperial decree across the entire Roman world. Suddenly, a tax collector in Britain and a magistrate in Syria were working from the same almanac. The kalends, nuns, and IDs of each month became universal deadlines. This imposed a powerful, invisible grid of order. The state could now plan its financial year, its religious observances like the Saturnalia, and its military recruitment cycles with perfect predictability. Time, which had once been as varied as the landscape, was now as standardized as a Roman road, a measured space through which the empire's business could flow without interruption or confusion. In China, the calendar held even deeper significance, as its accuracy was directly tied to the emperor's mandate of heaven. The Chinese calendar was a lunisolar masterpiece, complex in its calculations to harmonize the cycles of the moon and sun. Its promulgation was not a mere scientific update. It was a core imperial prerogative and a direct symbol of the emperor's role as the mediator between heaven and earth. Only the Son of Heaven had the authority to issue the official calendar each year. This document, distributed to every corner of the empire, did more than just tell farmers when to plant. It dictated the dates for all state ceremonies, the schedule for tax collection, and the auspicious days for everything from launching a military campaign to opening a new market. By controlling the calendar, the emperor controlled the very rhythm of life. A provincial governor who followed his own local timekeeping was not just being inconvenient, he was committing a subversive act, challenging the cosmic order upheld by the throne. The state calendar created a universal schedule for the corvée labor system, ensuring that millions of subjects knew exactly when their annual duty to work on state projects was due. It synchronized the massive empire-wide examinations for the bureaucracy, so scholars from distant provinces all sat for their tests on the same appointed days. This shared temporal framework was a silent, relentless teacher of imperial unity. When every household, from the palace to the peasant's hut, marked the passing days by the same set of names and festivals, they were unconsciously participating in a collective experience. Their personal lives became entwined with the imperial cycle. The power of this tool was its totality. It reached into the most fundamental layer of human experience, the perception of time itself. It replaced 1,000 local rhythms with one imperial metronome, ticking in perfect unison from the capital to the farthest frontier. The empire was no longer just a place on a map. It was a shared journey through the same measured year, a constant, quiet reminder that even the turning of the seasons now answered to the will of the state. A calendar organizes time, but an empire must also organize the people within it. The 16th tool was perhaps the most direct intervention into the very fabric of society, the deliberate resettlement and colonization of populations. This was not the natural migration of families seeking new land. It was a calculated administrative strategy, using human beings as geopolitical pawns to break resistance, secure territory, and rewrite cultural maps. The Assyrian Empire, at the height of its power in the first millennium before the Common Era, wielded this tool with chilling efficiency. Following a rebellion in a conquered region, Assyrian policy was not merely to punish the leaders. They would orchestrate a mass deportation. Entire communities, tens of thousands of people, were uprooted from their ancestral homelands and marched hundreds of miles to a different part of the empire. A rebellious tribe from the mountains of Armenia might find itself resettled in the flat plains of Syria, while a subdued population from Babylon was moved to the Assyrian heartland. The immediate goal was to shatter the social cohesion that fueled revolt. Uprooted people, stripped of their familiar landscape, their local temples, and their network of kin, were far easier to control. They became dependent on the imperial administration for land and protection in their new home. This brutal engineering diluted local identities and loyalties, turning potential hotbeds of rebellion into disoriented, manageable populations. The Roman Republic and Empire employed a different yet equally strategic form of colonization. Their primary instrument was the veteran colony. After a legionary completed his 25 years of service, he was often granted a plot of land. But this land was rarely in Italy. It was typically in a recently conquered or restive province. A city would be founded, its layout a perfect miniature of Rome itself, with a forum, a bathhouse, and a grid of straight streets. Hundreds of retired soldiers and their families would settle there. This served multiple administrative purposes at once. It provided for loyal veterans, fulfilling the state's promise. More critically, it planted islands of Roman culture and unwavering loyalty in potentially hostile territory. These veterans were not just farmers, they were a ready-made militia, a hardened reserve force that could be called upon to defend the region. Their very presence transformed the landscape. A local Gallic chieftain looking to stir trouble would now have to contend with a town full of former legionaries next door, men whose entire identity and livelihood were tied to the permanence of Roman rule. The colony acted as a cultural beacon and a military bulwark simultaneously, securing territory from the inside out. In China, particularly during the Han Dynasty and later expansions, resettlement took the form of state-sponsored migration to the frontiers. The government would offer incentives, land, tax breaks, tools, to families from the crowded central provinces to move and settle in the sparsely populated border regions near the Great Wall. This was a slow, persistent form of demographic engineering. The goal was to sinicize the frontier, to transform it from a nebulous zone of interaction with nomadic peoples into solid, agricultural Chinese territory. As these Han Chinese communities grew, they brought with them their plows, their written language, their administrative practices, and their social structures. They created a permanent human buffer. A nomadic cavalry raid would now encounter not just a wall and soldiers, but also fortified villages of farmers loyal to the emperor, who would defend their newly claimed fields. Over generations, these settlements shifted the very demographic and cultural balance of the region, making the frontier not just a line on a map, but a place where the empire's way of life had taken root. The underlying logic of this tool was a recognition that land by itself is passive. True control comes from the people who live on it. By moving populations, empires sought to solve several problems at once. They could break up concentrations of opposition, turning cohesive groups into scattered minorities. They could reward loyal servants with land in strategic locations, creating self-interested guardians of imperial order. And they could act as vectors for the spread of imperial culture, language, and agricultural practices, gradually blurring the line between the core and the periphery. It was a long-term investment in demographic stability, an attempt to weave the diverse threads of humanity into a tapestry whose pattern was designed not by chance, but by the deliberate, often ruthless hand of the state. The landscape itself was being remade not with monuments but with people. The true test of these administrative tools was not in theory, but in the sprawling, sun-baked reality of the ancient world. No empire put them into practice more effectively than the Achaemenid Persians, who ruled a territory stretching from the Indus Valley to the Balkans, the first empire to govern 3 continents. Their success was not a mystery of magic, but a masterclass in applied administrative genius, a symphony of systems working in concert. Take the satrapy system, their model of provincial governance. They divided their immense realm into around 20 provinces, each under a satrap. But this was not simple delegation. The satrap was a civilian governor responsible for collecting the fixed silver tax quota, maintaining local order, and serving as the king's representative. To prevent him from becoming a local king himself, the Persians embedded crucial checks. A separate military commander, answering directly to the great king, controlled the garrison. Royal secretaries monitored the satrap's correspondence and finances, and most famously, the king's eyes and ears inspectors and informants traveled the empire without warning, auditing everything from treasury counts to the mood of the people. This structure gave the satrap enough authority to govern effectively, while weaving a cage of accountability around him, ensuring his power could never truly challenge the center. To make this system breathe, however, required a circulatory system. That was the Royal Road and its accompanying postal network, the Angarian. This was not just a path for trade, it was a dedicated administrative highway. Couriers riding in relays could cover its 1,600-mile length in just 7 days. This meant a report of unrest in Egypt could reach the king in Susa almost as it began, and his orders could race back with the same terrifying speed. The road physically shrank the empire, turning months of uncertainty into a week of decisive action. It bound the satrapies to the capital with threads of constant communication, making the great king's presence felt daily, even in his absence. But communication alone is chaos without a common language. The Persians made a brilliantly pragmatic choice. They adopted Aramaic as the empire's official administrative tongue. The Persian elite spoke Persian, but Aramaic, with its simple alphabetic script on parchment, was already the lingua franca of merchants and scribes across the Near East. By training a cohort of imperial scribes in this common script, they created a seamless bureaucratic pipeline. A tax record from a satrapy in Anatolia could be read instantly by an auditor in Persepolis. Edicts could be issued in Aramaic and understood by officials from the Nile to the Indus. This linguistic bridge turned a cacophony of local dialects into a single, clear voice for the state. For that voice to have economic meaning, it needed a universal measure of value. Here, the Persians leveraged the power of standardization through their coinage, the gold darak and silver shekel. While not used by every commoner in daily trade, these coins were the lifeblood of imperial administration. They were used to pay the vast salaried armies and the growing bureaucracy. Imagine a Greek mercenary serving in the Persian army. His pay was not a promise or a pile of unmarked silver. It was a handful of coins, each stamped with the image of the Persian king, guaranteeing its weight and purity. That coin was accepted anywhere the king's authority reached. This created a direct, tangible link between the central state and every individual in its employ, fostering a loyalty built on reliable, portable wealth. It also streamlined taxation and commerce across the empire, reducing the friction of countless local barter systems and making the empire's economy legible and manageable. Perhaps the most subtle and powerful tool, however, was their policy of pragmatic religious and cultural tolerance. Unlike later empires that sought to impose a single god or creed, the Persian kings presented themselves as restorers of local order. After conquering Babylon, Cyrus the Great issued a cylinder declaring that he had restored the city's gods to their rightful temples and allowed deported peoples like the Jews to return to their homelands. This was not mere kindness, it was administrative sophistication. By posing as the protector of local gods and customs, the Persians drastically lowered the cost of control. They framed their rule not as the destruction of a culture, but as its preservation under a new, benevolent umbrella. This ideological stance, combined with their promotion of Zoroastrianism as a court religion that emphasized the king's divine mandate to spread truth and order, gave them a flexible moral authority. A subject in Egypt could keep his gods, a merchant in Phoenicia could keep his customs, yet both could understand the logic of a supreme power that guaranteed stability and respected their ways. It turned potential resistance into grateful, or at least compliant, participation. The Persian Empire stands as the ultimate ancient case study, a monumental achievement built not on battle alone, but on the quiet, relentless integration of road, coin, language, delegated power, and a brilliantly pragmatic ideology that made empire feel, for a time, like a sustainable order for the world. The Persian model proved the tools could work, but Rome refined them into an engine of unprecedented endurance. For centuries, the Mediterranean world answered to a single rhythm, not because every emperor was a genius, but because the administrative system beneath the throne was almost impervious to the man who sat upon it. This resilience began with a foundation of written rules so powerful they outlived the empire that created them. Roman law evolved from the 12 Tables, a public code that gave every citizen, at least in theory, a known standard. But its true administrative power was its adaptability and universality. As Rome grew, praetors and jurists interpreted and expanded these laws to cover disputes between Romans and non-citizens, and later, to govern all free people within the empire's borders. This created a common legal space from Britain to Syria. A merchant in Alexandria and a landowner in Hispania could enter a contract with confidence, knowing the same principles of property, obligation, and evidence would apply. The law became a silent, impartial governor, working day and night in countless courtrooms to reinforce a single idea, that Rome was not just a power but an order. To enforce that order across continents, Rome perfected the art of provincial management. A conquered territory became a province governed by a proconsul or propraetor, typically a senator serving a one-year term. This temporary appointment was a stroke of administrative genius. It meant no governor had enough time to build an independent army or a deep loyalty base among the locals. His career prospects depended on his successful administration and, crucially, on returning to Rome without facing prosecution for corruption. The province was not a personal kingdom. It was a temporary assignment on a resume, a single step in the Roman career ladder known as the cursus honorum. This system channeled the ambitions of Rome's elite directly into the service of imperial stability, ensuring that local power was always on a short, accountable leash. Yet a governor in a distant province would be powerless without a way to receive instructions and send reports. Rome's answer was a physical network of control so robust its remnants still shape continents today, its roads and the cursus publicus. The famous Roman roads, built straight and durable for the rapid march of legions, were the empire's skeletal system, but the cursus publicus was its central nervous system. Established by Augustus, this was a state monopoly on official communication and transport. Designated way stations along the roads provided fresh horses, vehicles, and secure lodging for any traveler on state business. Tax collectors, census officials, military couriers, and the governors themselves. A message or a command could now flow from the Rhine frontier to Rome in a matter of weeks, not months. This system shrank the psychological size of the empire, making the emperors will feel imminent and inescapable, even from 1,000 miles away. To know what to tax and who to govern, however, Rome needed perfect knowledge. This came from the census, an act of administrative inventory taken with relentless regularity. For Romans, the census was not merely a population count. It was a declaration of social rank, military obligation, and tax liability. Every head of household had to appear before a censor and declare his property, land, slaves, livestock, even household goods. This detailed registry, constantly updated, allowed the state to calculate precisely what it was owed and from whom. It turned the abstract mass of humanity into a classified, manageable resource. The census made the empire legible to itself, providing the data needed to fund the legions, maintain the roads, and feed the cities that were the pillars of Roman power. All of this bureaucracy required a common tongue, and Rome imposed one with quiet force, Latin. While local languages persisted in homes and markets, Latin was the language of law, military command, and high administration. To argue in a provincial court, to command an auxiliary troop, or to advance in imperial service, one had to master it. This created a translocal elite across the Western Empire. A tribal leader in Gaul who wanted his sons to prosper sent them to be educated in Latin rhetoric and Roman law. Over generations, this forged a provincial ruling class that thought, governed, and identified with the cultural world of Rome. The empire spoke in one official voice, and to be heard by power, you had to learn to speak back in its own language. But even the most efficient system can fray without a shared story. In its later centuries, facing internal division and cultural fragmentation, Rome co-opted a powerful new unifying ideology, Christianity. After Constantine's conversion, the empire gradually aligned itself with the church. This was a masterful administrative and ideological maneuver. Christianity offered a universalist doctrine that transcended ethnic and local loyalties. Its hierarchical structure of bishops could be mapped onto the imperial administrative map, creating a parallel network of authority that preached obedience to earthly power as a divine ordinance. By calling ecumenical councils to standardize doctrine, the Roman state actively shaped a unified orthodoxy. The shared faith provided a common moral and spiritual identity that helped bind together the disparate Greek East and Latin West, offering a sense of belonging that could, for a time, outweigh regional differences. The empire was no longer just a political entity. It was becoming a spiritual community, a holy commonwealth protected by God. The ultimate testament to this system was its resilience. Emperors rose and fell with startling frequency through assassination, civil war, or natural passing. Yet the machinery of state hummed on. The proconsul in Africa still collected the grain tax. The engineers along the Danube still maintained the frontier forts. The scribes in the tabularium still filed the census returns. The system had achieved a form of institutional immortality. It could absorb the shock of a failed ruler because it was built not on the cult of a single personality, but on the impersonal, repeatable processes of law, taxation, and communication. Rome demonstrated that the true secret to lasting empire was not finding the perfect king, but building a government that could function perfectly well without one. Across the world in China, a different civilization engineered its own imperial masterpiece, proving the administrative blueprint could be adapted to a unique cultural fabric. The Han Dynasty, ruling for 4 centuries, did not merely conquer territory. They constructed a governing machine of such sophistication that its core principles would define Chinese statecraft for 2,000 years. Their genius lay in weaving Confucian philosophy, economic control, and a revolutionary personnel system into a seamless whole. At the heart of this system was a radical idea that the state should be run not by hereditary nobles or wealthy elites, but by the most learned and virtuous men in the realm. This was the embryonic meritocracy of the imperial examination system. While fully developed in later dynasties, the Han laid the groundwork by establishing academies to teach the Confucian classics and by recommending local men of talent for government service. The ideal was a scholar official, a man who had memorized the ancient texts on ethics, history, and statecraft, and who saw his role as a moral steward for the people. This created a bureaucratic class whose loyalty was to the system and its ideology, not to a regional power base. A young man from a modest landowning family in the south could, through intense study, master the same classics as a candidate from the capital. If he passed the rigorous evaluations, he could be appointed as a magistrate hundreds of miles from his home, governing people whose dialect he might not even understand. His authority came from his learning and his commission from the emperor, making him a direct agent of the central state. To manage these officials across a continent-sized empire, the Han perfected an administrative grid known as the commandery and county system. The realm was divided into commanderies, each overseen by a governor appointed by the emperor. Each commandery was further split into counties run by magistrates. The critical innovation was rotation and non-native appointment. A magistrate was never assigned to his home county. He served a fixed term of a few years, after which he was evaluated and typically moved to a different post. This prevented officials from building local alliances or becoming feudal lords. Their success was measured by how well they implemented central policies, collected taxes, and maintained order according to the standardized Han code. They were cogs in a vast, impersonal machine, their personal fortunes tied to the efficiency of the system itself. This machine required a universal language, and here China possessed an ancient tool of unparalleled power, a standardized writing system. While spoken dialects across the empire could be mutually unintelligible, the written characters meant the same thing everywhere. An edict carved on bamboo slips in the Han capital of Chang'an could be sent to the humid south or the arid northwest, and any literate official could read and execute its commands precisely. This written language was the glue of administration, allowing for meticulous record-keeping, from population registers and land surveys to legal rulings and historical annals. It enabled the creation of a centralized archive, a permanent institutional memory that each new dynasty would inherit and build upon. But to pay for this immense bureaucracy and its standing armies, the Han needed a steady, colossal revenue stream beyond basic agriculture taxes. Their solution was a bold form of economic statecraft, government monopolies on key commodities, most notably salt and iron. Salt was essential for preserving food, and iron was vital for tools and weapons. By claiming exclusive control over their production and distribution, the Han state captured the profits from these universal needs. The policy was debated fiercely in court. Supporters argued it kept prices stable, funded defense against northern nomads, and prevented wealthy merchants from amassing power that could challenge the throne. Critics saw it as oppressive, yet the administrative effect was undeniable. It created a huge, centralized source of wealth independent of the land tax, financing infrastructure projects like canals and granaries, and paying the salaries of the growing scholar official class. The state became the economy's dominant player, its reach extending into the very pots people cooked in and the plows they used to till their fields. Underpinning all of this, the exams, the bureaucracy, the monopolies was a powerful, unifying ideology, Confucianism. Han rulers elevated Confucian teachings to a state orthodoxy. This philosophy emphasized harmony, hierarchy, and benevolent rule. It taught that society was structured like a family, with the emperor as the father of the nation, officials as his loyal sons, and the people as his children. For the scholar official, this was a sacred calling. His duty was to govern with virtue and compassion, to educate the people, and to maintain the cosmic social order. This ideology turned administration into a moral mission. It justified the power of the state as a force for civilization and stability. A peasant might never see the emperor, but he interacted with the local magistrate, who was expected to embody Confucian virtues. This created a powerful cultural bond, a sense that obeying the state was part of participating in a just and proper world. The Han synthesis was breathtaking in its coherence. The exams selected the officials, Confucianism motivated them, the writing system directed them, the commandery grid organized them, and the state monopolies paid for them. It was a self-reinforcing loop of control that sought to create not just an empire of force, but an empire of mind, where the ideal of orderly, virtuous governance became the deepest held truth of the civilization itself. Yet this magnificent machinery of control contained a fatal flaw. For every tool that strengthened the empire, a hidden cost accumulated in the shadows. The very systems designed to ensure stability could, over time, become the cause of its undoing. The first and most insidious danger was the bureaucracy turning in on itself. An administrative apparatus created to serve the state could slowly mutate into a self-serving organism. As empires aged, the number of officials, scribes, and inspectors often swelled. Each new layer was justified for better oversight or more precise record-keeping, but the result was a labyrinth of procedures. A simple request to repair a provincial granary might now require approvals from 5 separate offices, each demanding its own form in triplicate, stamped with the correct seals and filed in the proper archive. This red tape didn't just slow things down, it stifled the local initiative and adaptability that had once helped the empire thrive. Innovation in agriculture or engineering might be ignored because it didn't fit the standardized procedures established centuries prior. The system, built for predictability, began to prize process over results and preservation of the method over solving real problems. This administrative inertia made the empire rigid, unable to bend when new challenges arose, because the first response of any official was to consult the manual rather than think creatively. The weight of this ever-growing administrative class had to be paid for, and that burden fell directly on the economy through taxation. In the beginning, taxes funded roads, armies, and aqueducts investments that returned value to society. But as the bureaucracy expanded, an increasing portion of revenue was simply recycled to pay the salaries and maintain the lifestyles of the administrators themselves. The tax burden could reach a tipping point where farmers, artisans, and merchants were working not to improve their own lives or their community, but primarily to feed the insatiable appetite of the state apparatus. When a poor harvest came, the tax quota often remained unchanged, forcing families to sell their land or go into debt to local magnates who could pay. This slowly transferred wealth from the productive countryside to a class of wealthy landowners and tax farming officials, hollowing out the broad middle that had once been the empire's backbone. The state, in its hunger for revenue to sustain itself, was inadvertently strangling the very economy that gave it life. This environment became a fertile ground for the second fatal flaw: systemic corruption. The elaborate checks and balances designed to prevent abuse, like the Persian king's eyes or the Roman rotation of governors, only worked if the central authority remained vigilant and powerful. In times of weak leadership or succession crises, those constraints loosened. A provincial governor, knowing his term was short, might be tempted to extract as much personal wealth as possible before returning to the capital, imposing extra legal fees and selling favors. Tax collectors could collude with local elites to underestimate their holdings, splitting the difference. Even the lowliest scribe, responsible for recording a farmer's harvest, might demand a bribe to mark down a smaller yield. Corruption was more than just moral failing, it was a catastrophic system failure. It distorted the information the central state relied upon. The census rolls became inaccurate, the tax ledgers fraudulent, and the reports from the provinces painted a falsely optimistic picture. The emperor and his advisors in the capital were now making decisions based on a fantasy, believing the treasury was fuller and the people more content than they truly were. The empire was flying blind, its administrative eyes clouded by greed. Finally, these tools could fail simply because the world changed around them. A legal code brilliant for governing an agricultural society might be useless against the pressures of mass migration or new religious movements. A tax system calibrated for a population of 40 million might collapse when plague reduces that number by half, yet the remaining citizens are still expected to pay the old quota to support an undiminished army and bureaucracy. The military logistics network that supplied legions along a fixed frontier became a liability when enemies ceased to attack in predictable places and instead moved with fluid speed across entire regions. The very standardization that created unity could become a straitjacket, preventing the empire from adapting its tools to meet unprecedented threats. In the end, the cost of maintaining the imperial machine itself could exceed the benefits it provided. The empire became a grand and empty shell, its magnificent roads now carrying tax collectors to destitute villages, its vast archives filled with meticulously recorded data that no longer reflected reality, and its professional bureaucrats more focused on internal promotions and protocol than on governing a living, changing world. The collapse was often less a dramatic explosion and more a slow, silent dimming, as the administrative circuitry that had once pulsed with power gradually short-circuited under its own weight, leaving behind a landscape waiting for a new system to write its rules. The true test of an administrative system lies not in its theory, but in the harsh light of historical comparison. Look at the brilliant, fractured world of classical Greece. Here was a civilization that shared a language, gods, and a vibrant intellectual culture. Yet politically, it remained a landscape of fiercely independent city-states: Athens, Sparta, Thebes, each with its own laws, its own coinage, and its own tiny army. They were administrative islands. This fragmentation meant that even when they temporarily united against a common foe like Persia, the alliance was shaky and temporary. Coordination was a nightmare. Moving troops and supplies across borders required endless negotiation. Their collective strength was immense, but it could never be harnessed into a single, sustained imperial force because they lacked the unifying tools of a central bureaucracy, a standardized tax system, or an integrated road network. They proved that shared culture alone cannot build an empire. It requires the dull, systematic machinery of governance to translate potential into permanent power. Then came the kingdom of Macedon to the north. Under Philip II and his son Alexander, they adopted a different model. Philip reorganized the Macedonian army into the professional, integrated phalanx, but he also reformed the state. He centralized authority, created a royal treasury, and built a network of loyal, appointed officials. When Alexander inherited this system, he did not just conquer, he administered. He founded cities, Alexandria in Egypt being the most famous, that were not just military outposts. They were planned administrative centers with Greek-style grids, centralized marketplaces, and governors appointed by Alexander himself. He left officials behind to collect taxes, enforce law, and mint coins bearing his image. While his personal empire shattered after his passing, the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed, like the Seleucid Empire in Persia, retained and expanded these administrative tools. They demonstrated that the Macedonian system, a blend of military innovation with nascent bureaucratic control, could scale in a way the isolated Greek city-states simply could not. The contrast is stark, brilliant pieces versus an integrated machine. This pattern repeats across the grasslands of Central Asia. Here, charismatic leaders like Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan could forge terrifying confederacies of nomadic tribes. Their mobility and ferocity allowed them to conquer staggering territories, sweeping from the steppes into the heart of settled empires. But these conquests often proved ephemeral, like a storm that reshapes the landscape and then passes. The reason was a profound lack of administrative depth. A steppe confederacy was built for rapid mobilization and warfare, not for the patient, sedentary work of governance. Its cohesion relied on the personal authority of the leader and the promise of plunder. There was no professional bureaucracy to conduct a census of the conquered farmers in China or Persia. No standardized tax code to replace sporadic looting with reliable revenue. No network of scribes to keep land records or mediate disputes between settlers. Without these tools, the empire could not transition from extraction to integration. It remained a parasitic structure, draining wealth from conquered lands but unable to cultivate the long-term loyalty or economic stability that would make those lands permanently theirs. When the great leader died, the confederacy frequently splintered as rival heirs fought for the mantle of power, with no administrative institution to hold the realm together in the interim. Their power was personal, not systemic. This highlights the core lesson: conquest is an event, but empire is a process. The steppe warriors mastered the event. The great administrative empires Persia, Rome, China mastered the process. They built the scaffolding that allowed power to be exercised not just through fear, but through the predictable, daily rhythms of law, taxation, and communication. Without that scaffolding, even the most breathtaking military victories dissolve back into the map, leaving behind legends but not lasting states. The difference between a flash of lightning and the steady glow of a city's lamps is the difference between a conqueror and an empire. This immense administrative machine produced a torrent of information. Every harvest season, thousands of clay tablets and papyrus scrolls flooded into the royal archives, each one a data point on the empire's health. There were census tallies of every household, detailed tax receipts from remote provinces, inventory lists from frontier granaries, and dispatches from governors reporting on everything from local festivals to rumblings of discontent. The center had achieved its goal, it could see, but this created a new, paralyzing problem. The empire now suffered from an information paradox. It had successfully gathered the details of its world, but it lacked the capacity to truly understand them in time. The very systems designed to illuminate reality could, in fact, obscure it. Consider the journey of a single report. A minor official in a distant province observes the early signs of a poor harvest, unusual pests, a lack of rain. He writes his observation on a scroll. That scroll waits for the monthly courier run to the regional capital. There, it is added to a larger bundle of reports. The bundle travels by cart along a royal road to a central ministry. A junior scribe, overwhelmed by stacks of similar scrolls, logs its arrival. Weeks, perhaps months, after the first observation, a senior advisor finally unrolls the scroll and reads its contents. By then, the harvest in that province has already failed. The information was accurate, but it was history. The decision to send emergency grain based on this old data now races back along the same slow path, arriving long after the local crisis has either been resolved by the community or has spiraled into famine and unrest. The empire's reaction is perpetually out of phase with events on the ground, like a giant trying to swat a fly it saw a minute ago. The slowness of communication was only half the problem. The other half was the sheer, crushing volume of data and the primitive tools available to analyze it. A Persian king or a Roman emperor did not have dashboards or statistical models. He had rooms full of scrolls and tablets and a limited staff of scribes to read them. How could one person, or even a council of advisors, possibly synthesize the tax yields from 50 provinces, the population figures from 1,000 towns, and the weather reports from a continent? The answer was they couldn't. They were forced to rely on summaries and averages which smoothed over critical local details. A province might meet its overall tax quota, masking the fact that 3 of its counties were destitute and on the brink of rebellion, while one wealthy city had overpaid. The central view was a blurry, simplified map. Nuance was lost in aggregation. This often led to catastrophic misreading. A governor facing unrest might downplay it in his reports, fearing he would be seen as incompetent. His dispatches would speak of manageable tensions, while in reality, a full-scale revolt was brewing. The central authorities, seeing only the governor's sanitized words, might allocate resources elsewhere. By the time the truth became unavoidable, when no tax shipment arrived, or when a ragged band of refugees appeared at a neighboring province's border, the opportunity for a small, precise intervention had vanished. The state would then have to respond with the blunt, expensive instrument of the legions, a solution that could have been avoided with timely, truthful intelligence. The information paradox meant the empire's brain was often processing a reality that no longer existed, making decisions based on ghosts. It built a magnificent library of facts but lacked a card catalog. It could record everything, yet understand almost nothing in the moment that mattered. This was the ultimate limit of ancient administration. You could command the information to flow to the center, but you could not command it to arrive with speed or clarity. The state was forever listening to a delayed echo of its own realm, and in that gap between the event and the report, between the truth and the understood, empires could slowly lose their grip, responding with grand, decisive force to crises that had either already passed or had mutated into something entirely new. The administrative machinery of antiquity did not vanish with the last Roman legion or the fall of a distant dynasty. Its most durable components were not carved in stone for emperors, but woven into the very fabric of how we organize human society today. We still live in the long shadow of their bureaucratic ingenuity. Consider the quiet power of Roman law. When the empire fragmented, its vast legal code did not simply disappear. It was preserved, studied, and painstakingly copied by medieval scholars and the Christian Church. Centuries later, during the Renaissance and the birth of modern nation-states, European jurists rediscovered these texts. They found within them a comprehensive system for defining property rights, contracts, and civic obligations, principles that were secular, logical, and adaptable. This Roman foundation became the bedrock of the civil law tradition that now governs most of continental Europe, Latin America, and beyond. The very idea that law should be a written, coherent system, applied equally to citizens, is a direct inheritance from those ancient administrators trying to bring order to a diverse realm. A judge in a modern courtroom, referencing a legal precedent, is participating in a tradition of codified justice that Hammurabi would recognize and Caesar would approve. Across the world, a different legacy took root in the halls of power. The Chinese ideal of a meritocratic bureaucracy, selected through rigorous examination, proved to be one of history's most exportable administrative innovations. While the specific Confucian classics are no longer tested, the core principle, that state officials should be chosen based on demonstrated knowledge and skill rather than birthright or wealth, forms the basis of modern civil services. From the competitive examinations for diplomats and policy advisors in countless countries to the structured career ladders within government departments, we see the echo of the Han and Tang dynasty systems. The goal remains the same: to create a professional administrative class loyal to the state and its laws, capable of managing complex public affairs with a measure of impartial expertise. This ancient solution to the problem of who should wield power continues to shape how nations are run, prioritizing systemic knowledge over hereditary privilege. Perhaps the most tangible legacy is in your pocket and on every shelf in every store. The ancient drive for standardization, for a universal language of value and quantity, won its greatest victory. The Persian daric and the Roman denarius were early steps on a path that leads directly to the dollar, the euro, and the yen, but it goes far beyond coins. The entire architecture of global trade rests on a foundation of agreed-upon standards. The kilogram, the meter, the liter. These are the direct descendants of the bronze weights distributed by Qin Shi Huang and the measuring vessels used in Roman port warehouses. When a container ship leaves a factory in Vietnam bound for a warehouse in Germany, every customs form, every tariff calculation, and every invoice depends on a shared understanding of weight, volume, and value that transcends language and local custom. This invisible grid of agreement, which allows a global economy to function with minimal friction, is the ultimate triumph of administrative foresight. It solved the ancient problem of trust across distance, making the entire world a single, measurable marketplace. The true testament to these tools, however, is not just their survival in modern forms. It is the enduring relevance of the problems they were built to solve. Every large organization, whether a multinational corporation, a federal government, or a global non-profit, faces the same fundamental challenges that plagued Darius and Augustus. How do you ensure consistent communication across different divisions and continents? You build an information network, an electronic courier system of emails and servers replacing the Royal Road. How do you allocate resources fairly and predictably? You implement a budgeting and taxation system, a digital ledger of revenue and expenditure. How do you maintain quality and consistency? You enforce standards and operating procedures, the modern equivalent of codified laws and uniform weights. How do you prevent regional managers from becoming little emperors? You establish audits, reporting structures, and rotate personnel, the corporate version of the king's eyes and the non-native magistrate. The core dilemmas of scale, control, communication, and integration have not changed. We have simply developed new technologies to execute the same ancient administrative logic. The next time you receive a standardized report, follow a company protocol, or use a universally accepted measurement, you are interacting with the living legacy of those first empire builders. Their greatest monument was not a pyramid or a colosseum, but the very idea that human complexity could be managed through system, order, and record. We are still writing in their ledgers, walking their roads, and thinking in the frameworks they devised to hold a world together. So the story of empire is not told in the stone of its monuments, but in the clay of its tax receipts. The true foundation of every ancient superpower was not the charisma of its ruler or the strength of its legions, but the quiet, relentless hum of its administrative machinery. For centuries, we have marveled at the visible relics, the soaring pyramids, the sprawling walls, the triumphant arches. These were the empire's boast, its statement to the gods and to history. But they were only the spectacular symptom, not the cause. The cause was something far less glamorous. It was the scribe's cramped hand tallying grain stores by lamplight. It was the courier's pounding heart as he raced a warning down the royal road. It was the magistrate's patient adjudication of a land dispute in a distant province, following a code he did not write but was bound to enforce. These were the unseen foundations. Conquest creates a momentary fact, a border moved, a city taken. But administration creates a lasting reality. It is the process that transforms the chaotic, fleeting energy of victory into something stable, predictable, and, most importantly, extractable. An army can seize a valley's harvest one time. Only a tax system, backed by census data and enforceable law, can claim a portion of that valley's harvest every single year forever. A king can command loyalty from those who see his face. Only a bureaucracy, communicating in a standardized language and operating on a shared calendar, can command compliance from millions who will never know his name. This was the profound alchemy of these tools. They did not just manage an empire, they invented the very concept of empire as a sustained, governable entity. They turned geography into jurisdiction, people into taxpayers, and local chieftains into accountable officials. They built a cage of routine so sturdy that individuals could come and go, emperors could rise and fall, dynasties could change, while the system itself endured, its procedures outliving the personalities who created them. The durability of Rome, the reach of Persia, the continuity of China, these were not accidents of history or mere products of military might. They were the deliberate outcomes of an administrative blueprint. A blueprint that solved, with ingenious and often ruthless creativity, the fundamental problems of scale, how to see across continents, how to command across months, and how to integrate across cultures. The next time you see the ruins of an ancient capital, look past the broken columns, look for the ghost of the road that fed it, the echo of the law that ordered it, and the silent, forgotten ledger that counted every cost of its glory. The empire's true monument was its paperwork. These administrative tools represent a quiet revolution in the human story, a turning point as profound as the invention of the plow or the wheel. They mark the moment we learned to organize not just a village but a world. Before them, political power was personal, fleeting, and limited by the reach of a single voice. After them, power became systemic, enduring, and capable of projecting order across continents. The true innovation was not in conquering space, but in inventing the means to hold it. They created the very possibility of the complex, interconnected societies we inhabit today, proving that the deepest form of control is not the command that starts a war, but the system that sustains a lasting peace. So the next time you file a tax return, follow a traffic law, or even check the time on a standardized clock, you are participating in a legacy of ancient statecraft. It invites a final question for our own era. What are the administrative tools that define power and organization today? Is it the algorithm, the digital identity, the global supply chain? The fundamental challenge remains the same: managing scale, ensuring loyalty, and extracting resources, but the tools evolve. If you are intrigued by how systems shape our world, from ancient bureaucracies to modern networks, explore our other content on the hidden frameworks of history. The story of how we organize ourselves is the story of civilization itself, and it is always being written.